Good to have her class.
Okay.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fake news event. I am delighted to see this big a crowd here. Now I want to introduce the two speakers of the evening. First of all, Randall Mikkelsen, who has been doing some of these fake news events around the state, mainly in different public libraries. He's been working for Thomson Reuters since 1988. He's now a managing editor there. He was formerly a member of the White House Press Corps, and by that I mean that he covered the White House as an independent journalist, not that he worked for the White House. He covered the fall of the Soviet Union, he covered the impeachment of Bill Clinton, the war on terror, and the financial crisis. He also covered different governmental agencies, the Justice Department, and the CIA. And more recently, he's been doing these presentations on fake news. We are very lucky to have him with us tonight, and I'd like you to give him a hand. And we are also very lucky to have with us tonight Michael Kitch, who many of you know from his years working as a reporter for the Laconia Daily Sun. He worked there for 14 years covering, or 12 years covering local news, doing it fairly and doing it thoroughly, sometimes under trying circumstances. Michael did postgraduate work in England quite a few years ago, and then he taught for 12 years at the University of London. After that, he did various kinds of writing and reporting, mainly on a freelance basis. Subsequently, he worked at the New Hampshire State Senate and the State Senate President's Office, writing and doing advocacy. And following that job, that's when he went to the Laconia Daily Sun, where he worked as a reporter until very recently when he retired. Please give Michael a hand. And with that, I will turn it over to our speaker.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Debbie. There's a seat up here, by the way, I think, if you're looking for a seat. Yeah. And thanks to everybody for coming out tonight. This is really an encouraging crowd, and it's nice to have nice that you all could get out before the snow starts flying and making travel difficult later in the year. So this is really fun. I'm glad to see. It's amazing. I started giving these talks in January, and to see this kind of level of interest still strong is a bit telling in itself. And then the one other thing I'd like to thank is the public library system here in New Hampshire. As I've done these, I've probably spoken to a dozen or more, and I've just learned what a rich resource it is we have in New Hampshire to have a strong public library system. I know the funding, it's kind of insulated from daily political pressures, and they've proven to be a really unifying kind of community resource. So that's been one of the pleasant things I've learned in doing these talks. So we'll get started in a little survey. I'd like to know how many of you here are on Facebook, or have a Facebook account. Okay, most of the room. And how many use it more than 3 times a week? Again, about half the room, or maybe a little less, but okay. How about Twitter? Anybody have Twitter accounts? Okay, fair amount. What's that? Okay. And now we'll go to traditional media. How about subscribe to a print newspaper or magazine? Still a pretty good representation. But watch television news, either the evening network news or cable, almost the whole room. And one other thing, public radio. How many people listen to public radio? Always a really strong representation in these audiences for public radio. I find that kind of interesting. And then I guess just commercial radio. Again, yeah, most. Okay, a lot of news sources, and it's I see that elsewhere in the audience in the talks I give. This is a lot about social media, since that's what's contributed to the phenomenon. And if you don't have an account, I think you can still get something out of it, because what happens on social media is what's affecting our lives in many ways, including politically and economically. So, what we're going to do tonight, we're going to talk about the phenomenon of fake news and what we as consumers can do about it. We'll talk about some definitions and learn maybe exactly what is fake news. We'll talk about changes in the news industry, politics, technology, news consumption that have led us to this state. We'll talk about different types of fake news, misleading news that just kind of might have taken us from the original definitions of what we have understood news to be. And we'll talk about how to evaluate it, how to be wise news consumers, and how to fight fake news. And if we can do all that in an hour and a half or so, we'll have accomplished a lot. I do intend for this to be a conversation. If you have questions, raise your hand. Don't wait for the end. I'm not. I've got the material to carry me through, but I'd much rather do it in a conversation with all of you and with Michael. I'm going to try to localize it and see what, I'd like to learn, both of us would like to learn what you see here in the community, how the phenomenon might be affecting, your daily lives. So feel free to speak up. If I see a hand, just keep it up and I'll catch it and address your comment. So a little bit, see, a little bit of definition here. Fake news is not a new issue. This headline, this newspaper, it's from the 1980s. I think many people in the room might remember Weekly World News. It was in the supermarkets, checkout lines, and we all saw it, and you could laugh at I touched Bigfoot, and but it's been around. News historians will take you back to the early 1800s for the first examples of real news hoaxes. They had to do with life on other planets and things like that. There was one famous story came out of South Africa, spread like wildfire through the United States about men on the moon or on Mars. There is a long, I call it a continuum of fake or misleading news. It goes from propaganda to hype to bias. All these things mislead the audience, and it kind of lead them astray from underlying truth, you might say. And they're different from rhetoric, where you come out and say, this is what I want you, this is what I'm going to try to persuade you of, or try to convince you to believe, persuade you to believe. Upfront, open, structured. And it's different from simple mistakes. Where the news industry is replete with famous mistakes, some of which have had serious consequences. But I say that's a different phenomenon than deliberately falsified news. Some numbers to get us all started. I compiled this list today, and it rather startled me. 62% of Americans surveyed in a poll released last week said fake news eroded trust in traditional media. They said it also made them less likely to believe anything they hear or see in print or over the media. $2,500 a day. That's what a fake news producer earned in Macedonia from advertising on his website in the run-up to last year's elections. 18 countries in the world where online manipulation and disinformation played a role in elections, including the United States. 126 million people saw content from a Facebook page associated with Russian propaganda. That was testimony before Congress by the Facebook General Counsel. Last one, 5,000 data points on 230 million American voters. That's you and me. Cambridge Analytica, it's a political intelligence firm, and they also sell their data to commercial operations. But the point is, for you and me and everybody else, they know 5,000 things about us, whether it's where we spent money last week, or what our favorite TV shows are, this, that, and the other thing. They've acquired it legitimately, legally, and they sell that basically to the whoever's willing to pay for it. In the last election, well, they have been aligned with personnel and politically with the Trump movement, but that's not really the point here. The point is that there are firms who can collect that much information on you or I and use that to manipulate or to affect our behavior through advertisements, through reaching out to us. So 5 pretty stark numbers that illustrate a pretty wide-reaching phenomenon. So what has led us to this point? Does anybody recognize this drawing here? I heard something. Telegraph, yeah, Morse code. Yeah, it's the original patent model for a telegraph. The reason that bears on this discussion tonight is that the telegraph was a big factor in the development of the concept of objectivity in news and the standards of objectivity in news. Came around the middle of the 19th century, mid-1800s, and what it allowed to happen was news could be transmitted over great distances instantly. And it would come to a small town like Laconia, which I understood until recently had 2 newspapers, right? Is that
the only town north of Boston with 2 newspapers?
One of the few left in the United States at the time. Yeah. But so the point was, back in the day, and a newspaper could wear its politics on its sleeve, and they can and did, and not just in the editorial pages, but in the front pages, so forth and so on. But and so news was a kind of a political activity in many ways, but the telegraph allowed news organizations to be set up to serve all these little newspapers around the United States, around the world. But to do that, they couldn't take a political stance. Their news had to be right down the middle. So the Democrat paper and the Republican paper could both subscribe to this news from afar. So these services had developed the concept of objectivity. And that Associated Press was an early newswire service. My outfit, Reuters, was similar. That lasted through the television era and radio, in that the government's allocated frequencies over the airwaves, and they treated those as a scarce resource. And so in order to get a license to operate on a radio frequency, a television station or a radio, the companies had to promise or pledge to abide by certain standards. And these included fairness and right of reply and objectivity in general. That started breaking down in the cable television era. Cable TV was not considered a public resource. It was more of like a private channel, and with the multiplicity of channels, these organizations could arise that would serve very diverse audiences, target them narrowly, and they didn't have to worry about things like presenting both sides or whatever, or serving a wide audience of viewpoints. So they could the information they transmitted could be more biased. And I'll say biased in a non-pejorative term right here. They could take a side. That led us, does anybody recognize this?
World Wide Web.
World Wide Web, original logo of the World Wide Web from the mid-1990s. What the web did was enable anybody to reach everybody. You could set up a website, reach the whole world. And then with Google and its sophisticated algorithms that could turn up stuff instantly on all these websites. And so what this led us to a year ago last week, was you could search Google, final election numbers, and the top story that appeared on Google said that Donald Trump won the popular vote. We know that's not true, but it appeared on my Facebook feed. It appeared in a lot of places. And as you can see, this is the news organization, or the organization cited here. It's something called 70 News. It's on WordPress.com, which is kind of a public access, free blogger site or cheap blogger site. Down here, you get to the Washington Post, but basically what it means is somebody sitting in their room in their pajamas could top Google with a fake news story about the election. So that's the technology that made it possible. There's economics. Right? This is kind of an outlandish headline. I think this appeared in my Facebook feed. I may have seen it some other way, but it has enough, plausibility and outrageousness that maybe you'll call it up, if you see it. Well, if you do, you're going to get served up with a nice fat ad for Dodge Ram pickup trucks. That's a legitimate ad paid for by Chrysler Corporation. And then the revenue from that ad goes to the owner of the website. Now, Chrysler doesn't set off and say, I want to buy an ad on a website that says, Yoko Ono and Hillary Clinton are having affairs. They buy eyeballs. They say, I want to buy 2 million eyeballs and maybe, with these or that characteristics. And so I call up that web page, it serves me up a Dodge Ram ad. Maybe somebody else gets a different ad. But the point is there's a channel from the producer of the fake news site to their bank account via Chrysler Corporation. So that it gives it an economic base. So let's talk about definitions. What is fake news? I saw an interesting survey the other day that said most people believe fake news is sloppy reporting. The next biggest tranche was was stories that were insulting somebody politically. Well, that's not the definition I assign it. I say it's deliberately false. It's a hoax. It's knowingly false. For this discussion tonight, I say it's spread via social media. And it can be about politics, but not always. It can be about business. It can be about science. It can be about any kind of deliberately false story that is put out to have an impact. This is an example. This ran right after the hurricane in Houston. Black Lives Matter thugs blocking emergency crews from reaching hurricane victims. It had a photo to go with it. The photo was from a protest 3 years ago or something. Purely false, deliberately false. Remember this name, Our Land of the Free.com. We'll come back to it later in the presentation. And I'll pause for a minute and say, Michael, have you seen any local fake news?
Not really.
Okay.
And I was listening to you. I was thinking that it really highlights the role of a small local paper. Because
To verify or
you
to
couldn't get away with it. If I'd done this sort of thing in Laconia, I'd be,
run out of town.
hanging from some
Yeah.
trees up. I mean, because you're dealing with a face-to-face community of people that you deal with all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
And it's ironic because the local papers are the ones that are struggling. Well,
Yeah.
these folks are making
Rolling in the
millions of
dough.
dollars.
One thing locally you might see is there's a category or a story that gets circulated around, but I saw a former White House spokesman circulate this story from his hometown, thinking it was believable. But it goes something like, Leonardo DiCaprio had this to say about Laconia. He was in, Laconia filming a movie, and his car broke down, and a guy helped him and brought him a sandwich. And Leonardo said Laconia is the most wonderful town in the world. Real folks here. Well, okay, that's a fake news story that gets local pretty quickly, and it just works off your zip code and stuff and feeds it into your social media feed. And it's really credible because people like their hometowns. I mean, we all do.
I need to challenge what Michael was saying, because it's not the social media in his former newspaper, but it's the letters.
Oh, well, okay. I mean, that's...
The letters are using that fake news, and they're coming in and appearing to act daily.
There aren't real fact checkers in the letters to the editor section, are there? That's an interesting point. Thank you. Did you, sir?
The people who write this, I mean, are ultimately responsible, but also they're people that don't fact check and they pass this stuff on and believe it in themselves. I mean, they sincerely believe it's true, but I think there you've got two types of ignorance. You've got the people that are innocently ignorant just because they don't know, and then you've got the, what I call the willfully ignorant. I mean, and can you really fight them with information? I mean, some of them think that fact-checking sites like Snopes are a government conspiracy.
Right, Snopes has its own, yeah, that's very true. Now,
I will confess, I did write one fake news story.
okay, here we go. Public access, let them
On April
know.
Fool's Day, we were about raising the level of the lake. To create more opportunities for waterfronts.
More lakeshore.
And we got at least, as far as I can tell, maybe 2 or 3 people who read it and were very upset with the Department of Environmental Services.
That's funny. No, that's, some newspapers do that or get away with it. Our organization would never, and we have been, subject of like April Fool's press releases and things, hoaxes, and I'm trying to remember. I can't think of a specific incident where we got snookered, but I know there have been cases where we've gotten deceived by hoax stories. But yeah, April Fools, we always get notices. Watch out, today's April Fools. Give yourself an extra pinch to make sure it's real. So thank you for contributing to the decline. No, so anyway, willful. This is one of those fake news authors who earns hundreds of dollars a day in Macedonia. This was from a year ago, or November of 2016, I think they did this story. Dimitri was his name. He said the most read news articles have clickbait words, and I'm sure we all recognize them by now. Breaking news, all in capital letters, and oh my God, wow. And what he says is, you produce 10 lies a day, the audience isn't going to believe 10 lies, but they'll believe 1 or 2, and if that gets you to click on his website and he gets ad money, he's succeeded. He said the lies, lies about Clinton were the most successful, but he was agnostic, really, politically. He just was going for what would get the most attention and eyeballs on his site. Fake business. This is where it starts to affect our pocketbooks. This has to do with Fitbit, the maker of the exercise trackers. A gentleman concocted a fake takeover offer for Fitbit, and he submitted it electronically to the Securities and Exchange Commission's repository for where you're required, if you make a takeover offer, you've got to submit it. He submitted a fake one. There are automatic services that scrape these submissions, put out little news stories out on wires to financial markets without any human intervention, and markets react. So this thing fell for the fake news offer, or for the fake takeover offer. It went out on into the markets. Share price responded. This guy, then sold when the price went up, got a bunch of money, and then got arrested. They were onto him pretty quickly. But it's out there. Fake science. Health is like a horrible, cesspool of bad information on the web, and especially through social media. This story here: scientists find a root that kills 98% of cancer cells in only 48 hours. Refers to dandelion roots. There was no such study, and it was the most popular story shared on Facebook in 2016 that had the word cancer in it. So the stuff is powerful. It has powerful psychological effects on all of us.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
Is that one sort of like yelling fire at a theater?
Well,
Can they
yeah, the whole
get
thing.
in legal trouble doing that?
No, they really can't. That's and I'll get to you in just a second. If you're commercially advertising something and you make a false statement, you can be held legally liable. If you defame somebody, you can be held legally liable. But those are kind of the two circumstances, and both of those require you be able to identify who's doing it, or that they have any money to go after them for, and that kind of thing. So it's pretty hard to stop something like this, which just makes a, phony health claim. And they're all over. You can't jump on Facebook without reading about the latest food that'll kill you or the latest food that'll cure you. Sir.
I think the way that this stuff is most successful is it plays on emotions. Cancer is kind of a really emotionally charged subject, but a lot of people have had family members die from it. And they can make a lot of money just by having that keyword, or that clickbait. Emotion's
a really powerful issue in what we're discussing tonight. People react emotionally, and the purveyors have figured out really sophisticated ways of getting that reaction. Fake news ads. This is an ad. Sacramento Dispatch. Anybody hear of that? There isn't one. I'll tell you. But this, again, this popped up in my Facebook feed. Oh, that Facebook feed. That sounds reasonable. Trump and Putin spotted at a Swiss resort. It's feeding our speculation about what happened. What this was an ad for a movie. I think 21st Century Fox launched this campaign. And the point was to get you to click through and then see this ad or trailer for a movie at which kind of the slipperiness of truth had some kind of relevance. But my point is, here's a commercial company, one specializing in communications, and they recognize that fake news is in the air. It's a phenomenon. People respond to it, so they're trying to make money out of the phenomenon for their product. Just another dimension at which it's entering our consciousness. Big breaking news. People are acting really quickly nowadays. This was the Texas church shooter, right? And I actually did this, just reacting like a normal citizen to news of this Texas church shooting. I heard the guy's name. I plugged it into Facebook. And this is the kind of thing I saw right away, that killer Devin Patrick Kelly is said to be a radical alt-left Antifa member. And Antifa is the anti-fascist, kind of the militant left. These things, this kind of reaction was all over the internet very quickly. This another one here. This is a guy very active on YouTube. He's got hundreds of thousands of followers. He put out, again, a totally made up out of whole cloth. Shooter is a white Bernie Sanders supporter, maybe Antifa terrorist. So if you or I go looking on the web for information about this guy, this is the first thing we might see. Ma'am?
Why do you think people are so ready to believe these far out, ridiculous stories? What has happened to our critical thinking skills?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, honest to God, it is.
Is it schools that aren't teaching critical thinking? Is it we who are seduced by social media just because it's fashionable?
I'd say yes and yes. No, seriously, I'd say yes and yes. And there's more, and we'll keep talking about that.
I think there's a lot of major cultural elements in all of this. And I think one of them is that there is, just like there's been a fracturing of the audience or the electorate along all kinds of lines, there's a lot less shared acceptance of certain things as being foundational or basic things that everybody can agree on.
Yep.
If you go online, you will find many people who will argue endlessly that World War II was started by Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
That's what they believe. They're not making it up.
Yeah.
And there's a spectrum.
Right. They'll say, "Oh, I've looked into this, and there's a yeah."
And Pat, there's a spectrum there. So it's people who are just kind of amateur historians. But Pat Buchanan wrote a book about World War II, The Unnecessary War. So it kind of bleeds together.
Yep.
And with that is the American tradition of challenging authority. We're not going to accept what this elite gives us. We're going to find out the real truth by digging around, and the little guy in the corner who might have the real truth.
Yeah.
All of that.
And that makes us feel special too. You had a question.
First.
Well, I think the way this stuff becomes, again, I think it's emotional, but I think the way this stuff kind of targets people is confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
People want to believe this stuff. They're very politically charged. They really think, or maybe they're Trump supporters and they don't like Bernie Sanders supporters.
Yep.
And they want to believe that Bernie Sanders supporters are terrible people.
Right.
So they kind of look for things that confirms what they believe.
Yeah. And I think if we each look inside to each of us, we'll acknowledge that too. I mean, I look at these things. I try to find out, who did it, what's the motive. I mean, these things are horrible. I mean, it's just a sickening thought that, okay, the first thing that happens after an incident like that, we try to find out who it is, and is it part of our belief system, or is it, and is it the opposite? And you get a defensive reaction or an aggressive reaction. And if it's, if it confirms your suspicions, you'll share that right away. Oh my God, look at this, Antifa terrorist. It's, you're right. We now have sources where we can go to that feed our confirmation bias. You can live within this community of, Antifa haters or whatever, and never get outside it. Whereas maybe, back in the days when there were 3 broadcast networks and 1 or 2 newspapers that set the agenda for everybody else, you were forced to confront kind of what the general public was getting more than you are now.
The wonderful part about our schools, this is just information that I know and I've lived through, is that they actually teach you to look for certain key things that not only in newspapers, articles, books, anything on the website, honestly, they'll actually teach you to look out for certain things that will make it so that they know it'll be indeed fake. not only that, there's also multiple courses that will guide you through that, and there's courses on critical thinking as well. So
So the resources are
there's
there.
resources are there.
Yeah, yeah. Good point. And I'll go to Michael and then you, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that, and I don't know if you've been through all your examples, but they're all basically.
Oh no, I got a bunch of them.
They're all basically headlines, and at most a paragraph.
Well, right.
And to me, one of the biggest changes in the media has been the eclipse of the typographic media by the photographic or visual media.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is akin to visual media. There's no, you can't write an article without making some sort of rational argument or orderly exposition.
That's correct.
But television news is bites.
Yep,
And this is bites.
yep.
This belongs, even though it looks like words and letters, it's really a visual product. And it grabs you with the brief headline because there's nothing beyond that you can say, because there's nothing there to prove.
Right, right. But it's had its reaction. You can
This is
share
kind-
it, you
this
can
is
whatever.
kind of the illegitimate cousin of television news, as far
Yeah.
as I'm concerned. It's the spin-off.
Okay,
And it started with television news, packaging stories, and of course, if the story is tax reform, there's no picture.
right, right.
So-
And there's no headline either, because you got to wait to read 1,000
You
pages
can't
of a
do it.
bill or something.
And that to me is really at the bottom of why so many people have become so susceptible to this sort of stuff, is because people don't read anymore.
Yeah,
It's too much work.
I knew a man in my hometown, older than me. He's in his 80s now. He must have been in his late 70s when this happened. And pretty much, as somebody just mentioned, wanting to believe things about President Obama. So watched Fox News, everything on social media that was anti-Obama he believed. I had to spend 3 long emails because this guy was scared to death that Obama was going to put him in front of a death panel. You know,
I can't hear you.
yeah, when he turned
He was-
80.
he was
When turned
afraid
80.
that
And the
Obama
thing is,
would-
I gave him all the resources on why that wasn't on page 425 of Obamacare, and he still didn't believe me. How do you, you know, and then when I said, look it up on Snopes or something, well, Snopes is literally
Yeah,
biased.
yeah,
How do you
yeah.
argue with that stuff?
it's hard.
Yeah.
And you know, if he wants to live with his delusions, maybe you just got to say,
Well, he was a
okay,
scared old
you know,
guy.
yeah. I know, or if you're trying to put him at ease, that's a,
All his heart.
yeah. So, a little exercise, or a little, go through a couple examples. Classic fake news story. Yeah, this was a survivor from my first year, the first version of this slideshow. I change it every single time. New York Journal. Anybody know that newspaper? No, doesn't exist. But the type looks nice, right? It looks like, oh my God,
The thing is, that's
Almost kind of looks like the
actually,
New York Times.
an Augusta newspaper. Yeah.
I'm gonna be fully honest, I have seen the New York Journal website, and they used it actually in a college thing for saying that it's a fake website.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It is. But you know, okay, so that's it's plausible. This was in my Facebook feed. I called it up. What's going on? But if you look on the side, it says. Let's just actually let me go see if I can get it a little clearer. Yeah. Okay, we'll get to it later. But one of the things I try to do when checking out a suspect site is click up here in the bar for an About section. Now you'll notice this doesn't have an About section. So I clicked on the US section and I get something like this. I clicked somewhere else and I got like a ransom note, you know, that if you don't turn off your computer, or if you don't pay us, we'll take all your money or something. So that's kind of a clue that something's wrong. these stories, I did manage to get through to the U.S. section. And the stories, whale sighting near Washington Bridge, that really happened about a year ago. It swam upriver. Fugitive kills U.S. Marshal serving warrant in rural Georgia. That was kind of lost in the chaos of the election news, but that really happened. Fantasy football merger. So those things happen, but you look here, this is all gobbledygook, these first paragraphs. So the fugitive kills Marshall story. This says, old ideas that have a guest can all individuals who has the secret, blah, blah, blah. It's just gobbledygook. You look here, trending headlines, insider speaks out. Hillary campaign staffers snorted coke off the Bible, held abortion contest. It sounds like, see? And it's kind of bipartisan, KKK leader David Duke named to head Department of Education. But, we may laugh, but look at this, a real Walgreens ad. A real Mucinex, I think it is. So again, somebody's paying for this, and we as consumers, are giving whatever fraction of a penny these guys get for that eyeball.
I heard that one somewhere else, that busloads of illegals are hauled across the border to vote for Hillary. Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah, well, being in New Hampshire, one might hear that. Yeah, that was... okay, so now we get beyond hoaxes to, I call it hype, or just, misleading stuff. The fires in California, there was a homeless man arrested. He had a fire under a bridge in the same county. It was carried on a local wire, this Breitbart News picked it up and reworded it this way. So it was covered. They covered a story, and then after that story, the Immigration Service ordered the guy held. He was, he didn't have papers. So this is how they wrote it up. ICE detainer issued for suspected wine country arsonist in Sonoma jail, which to a reader might think, oh, this guy lit all the fire. An illegal immigrant started all the fires that are burning Sonoma County. Not true. The sheriff's office vehemently denied it. They said he was, the incident this guy was involved in was in no relation to all these big fires. So the point is, take a grain of truth, spin it wildly, and you get a sensational story that feeds into people's preconceived notions, makes a great thing to share. I think, what do they have, 37,000 shares or something? That's how that works. Both sides of the aisle. Bob Corker launches Senate hearings aimed at destroying Donald Trump. Those hearings were today, I think, and they were looking into the presidential authority to launch nuclear weapons, a serious issue blown out of proportion by the headline. PalmerReport.com. This is one of the more notorious left-wing hype sites. These guys make money both ways. You're a conservative, you want to look at liberal society, you're a liberal, you want to look at liberalsociety.com, you'll learn that the White House is ready to give Kellyanne Conway the boot. Are you glad? There's your emotional trigger, right? Oh my God, yes, okay, boom, share this. But if you're a conservative, you might see the White House just gave Kellyanne Conway the boot. Prepare to be infuriated. My God, this pisses me off. But these guys make money either way, whichever propels you to act.
The wonderful part about actually this day and age is due to the fact that we are we rely so much on internet and social media that things like this just constantly fly by, and it's just nitpicking every single thing that we're looking at within seconds, and people will just go through it
and they'll believe it.
That's right. That's right. We don't even check it. It might not even register. You say, oh, yeah, you know, this is more compelled like for action, right? They want you to have an emotion. They want you to notice it and react emotionally.
They
But-
want to draw your attention
Yeah.
more to reading it than to actually fact checking.
Yeah. But I've seen studies that say even if you say this is a fake news story, people don't remember that part. They remember the headline, you know. How it spreads. There's, you know, kind of an informal little network, starts with the facts. There's a lot, it's like a political or news industry, influencers you might call them, where they pick up on these things, spread it around among themselves, send out talking points to broadcasters, you know, the commentators and so forth. Those guys go give it, they amplify it through their own news channels and outlets, you know, whether it's talk radio or, you know, all the talk television shows, the pundit shows they have and so forth. And then it becomes kind of this alternate reality. And even the mainstream middle of the road outlets that try to cover both sides have to say, oh my God, everybody's inflamed about this, you know, this bias stuff that starts here. Then you got to start reporting on it, and that spreads it further. Just a little thing, but New York Times opinion section here, nicely labeled. This is in Facebook feed, off their Facebook page. There's a smell of treason in the air. Did a traitor work with Russia to help Trump? Fair game for an opinion writer on the opinion page of the New York Times, right? And I'm sure it was a logically organized piece, and you know, you can believe it or not, or accept it or not. Nicholas Kristof is a significant columnist, but people start sharing it, and then this is what you get. You get the New York Times. There's a smell of treason in the air. And you lose that context that it's an opinion piece. And then you think, well, my God, the New York Times is being really strident here. Or they really are that, you know, left-wing fake news outlet that's saying, you know, reporting a traitor worked with Russia, whatever. So that's just a small labeling issue, but it shows how views can get twisted, even inadvertently, by the channels through which news is distributed. Then errors. One of the most significant reporting mistakes of the last 20 years was the New York Times series of articles in the run-up to the Iraq War holding that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction programs. They were fed bad intelligence by the administration, by the White House, and by their Iraqi allies, and it supported. It was part of the build-up to war in Iraq, and then they came out afterwards and kind of confessed a little begrudgingly, a little wishy-washy, but that they'd been sold a bill of goods. The point here is this news outlet acknowledged that it screwed up. And they did it before. They did it on the Soviet famine in the 1930s. They said there's no famine here. And there was one of the great historic famines. So they do screw up.
Could you at some point talk about Snopes?
Yeah, I will. Absolutely will. Yep.
Because for me, maybe I'm way off base, but I use it a lot.
Yep.
To check things and find out just that it's not categorized like you have done it, but yet that's what they're doing, is identifying where the faults.
Yep. I will talk about Snopes, and you're absolutely right, and I will endorse it, for anybody. And there are other outlets as well, but Snopes, I've been with them for years. Sir.
I lived through 1964, 65, 66, when the Vietnam War was winding up.
Yep.
And I think this generation's and succeeding generations got a real lesson in how not to trust either government or big media, because they were just hand in glove. They just printed whatever came their way, and there was It was only the alternative, the IF Stones and the Ramparts, who were doing any real reporting on the war. And
Yep.
even when you have all the major national leaders of the time have fessed up, this country still believes that somehow it was the protesters that caused the war
Yeah.
and lost us the war.
So that's a good point. I would argue, and I mean, I don't mean to I wouldn't argue, but I'm thinking of, Walter Cronkite going with CBS, going to Vietnam in 1968 and saying,
Well, by
I've
then
been there,
things
I
had-
can
yeah.
see, this is not going to win. And that was a huge turning point in public sentiment. The work by the other journalists you cite, I think, helped plant seeds for that. These things take a long time to develop sometimes. And I think that's an element. I think you're right, that major media was overly accepting of what the government was telling them. So all those things played into it. I think your analysis is basically correct. But I think there was a point at which even the major media said, no, we see now that things are askew or that there's problems here.
I lived in England at that time,
Yeah.
and the BBC had a correspondent in Vietnam by the name of Julian Pettifer. I don't know if anybody's name means anything, but he was extremely critical of the whole thing. And it struck me that ABC, NBC, CBS at the time were the big television news. These are huge corporations. They don't cross the government. And that's part of the problem, is that the media is a business.
Well, that's right.
And-
It is a
and-
business.
Here was the publicly owned broadcasting corporation, had no qualms whatsoever in saying that this was a misguided adventure at the time.
So jump forward.
Very different.
Yeah, I bet.
Jump forward to last week when AT&T, Time Warner learned that their merger may be threatened unless they divest CNN. Very similar corporate pressures, on media. And remember, some of the strongest independent voices in the media have been New York Times, family owned, but even they're now publicly traded, and so there are those kinds of pressures. But the commercial dependence of media is a factor, clearly. I'll move on. Well, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, you're also talking about a society that believed at one point way back that War of the Worlds was an actual thing going on the radio, and thousands of
that's
people either were panicking and either hurting themselves during that time, thinking that actual literal figural species were coming and destroying the planet at that time.
Well, remember, P.T. Barnum was not a poor man.
Okay. So
I was going to say, another thing I have recognized is, I used to know that satire, if it came from the New Yorker or from the Onion, right?
Yeah, right.
You've got some of these people that will put up satire, and until you read it carefully, you can't tell satire from reality.
that's right. That's an issue. Yeah. It took us a while, like my mother or whatever, a while to figure out what the Onion was about. And I think most of the room can understands where they're coming from. But still, you're right. The secondary satire sites are hard to figure out. So, the first series of talks I gave on fake news dealt a lot with the pure hoaxes and that kind of thing. Propaganda has become a bigger, more substantive part of this. For the purposes here, I will call it information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. I think it also implies kind of a political organization behind it, whether it's a state or a party or similar organization, a political movement. Propaganda has a political nature. Obviously we got to talk about Russia and the U.S. This was real, though, ladies and gentlemen. This was one of the ads that Russia funded Internet Research Agency, the so-called troll farm in St. Petersburg, put on Facebook that 126 million of us were exposed to. And this is just one bite of their apple. And it doesn't say, courtesy of Russia, it says Army of Jesus. And, they were doing things like organizing immigration rallies in Idaho and things like that through Facebook. Pretty sophisticated operation. Plus, combined with those analytics, the like 5,000 data points that they knew about you, they could target these and nobody else would see it. I mean, people who weren't receptive to that message wouldn't see it.
Probably could target religious people, or people that would be more easily swayed by this.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, they can kind of figure out if you've been
And so, if Clinton, so this is targeting religious opponents of Hillary Clinton. But they also ran ads like, Hillary Clinton, about her policies were bad for black people, put black people unjustly in jail. And there's a legitimate debate about crime policies under Bill Clinton and so forth. But they knew who they were targeting, and with that ad, it was intended to suppress the vote of black voters who might otherwise go out and vote for Hillary Clinton. It's a very sophisticated targeting, and not something that hasn't been done before in political elections, but it's being done with more power and precision now.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why would that one not be called just fake news? Why are you calling that propaganda?
Well, because it's not pretending to be news. It's not under the guise of a news report. It's just, it says sponsored. It says it's an ad, a like page. It's a fake organization, but it doesn't say we're a newspaper, or it doesn't call themselves. But Sputnik, another Russian government-funded organization, holds itself out as a news website. They were implicated in release of hacked DNC emails, very early release, like they had access to it before other people did. They've since changed their tune a little bit. They were mad at Trump over his UN speech. They called New Hitler. Iranian Venezuelan leaders lash back at Trump's UN rant. That's pretty obvious kind of propaganda, but it doesn't say where Sputnik's coming from. Russia Today is even more widespread, controversial, second most popular, second behind CNN as a YouTube news channel. It had like 2 million followers, something like that. Russia RT, is again Russian government funded. Just this week, they were required to register as a foreign agent by the United States, and Russia has vowed retaliatory actions against U.S. journalists in response. Now, the United States is not, it doesn't have clean hands in this either. In Iraq, they ran the Joint Psychological Operations Task Force. Very similar kinds of propaganda, painting the enemy as bad and their efforts, our efforts, as good. They attempted to influence all kinds of social activities. Back into the Cold War, Radio Free Europe broadcast behind the Iron Curtain with propaganda messages. There was the more overt, or there was the Voice of America, which had a principle of broadcasting unbiased news, but behind the Iron Curtain as well, just to give, kind of what they viewed as a truer picture. But there was also the more strident propaganda operation under Radio Free Europe. White Houses have, political parties have gotten into the act. This was a news, web-based news, YouTube-based news program run by Trump supporters. Obama had a similar thing, out of the White House, West Wing Week, maybe a little less overtly political, a little less critical. This was all about, the good things, kind of feel-good type stuff. But the point is, the political institutions, the White House has developed these means of going beyond and around news outlets to reach us. When I was at the White House, when I started my career earlier, I really viewed myself as a channel between government or an interpreter between government and the audience. Now, the role of the media is more of like an adjunct, because Trump gets out with the president has his Twitter account, to reach millions of people instantly, and then the press picks up on the Twitter account and amplifies it further. Much different way of reaching the public. The Republican Governors Association, and again, I'm not picking on Republicans, but this did crop up from the Republican Governors Association. The Free Telegraph was a website, looks like a news organization, run by the government, but run by the Republican Governors Association. They look like news stories, and they are designed to promote a partisan political strategy. Okay, so computers get into the act. You've got the Twitter bots. These computer programs send out tweets that reflect a point of view, and in doing so, they send topics up the Twitter ranking, the trending ranking. They make it more visible, make it appear like support for one candidate or another is like there's a groundswell, but it's all outside human hands, automatically generated. In the last election, both the Trump and Clinton campaigns used them. I think the statistics show there were more on the Trump side, but both sides had figured out how to use this. Facebook targeting, we talked about that with the numbers. 5,000 data points on each one of us, and they could take out the very sophisticated targeted Facebook ads. Now people have gotten into the act of tracking it. Hamilton 68 is run by some former intelligence professionals, and they monitor 600 Twitter accounts linked to Russian influence operations. At this time, so the trending hashtags had to do with like the Trump, the dossier on Russian activities, things like that. Top hashtag, Make America Great Again. So there's people watching for that. So now we get into what do you do about it? How do we as consumers tell if a story is legitimate, true, fake, whatever? How do you deal with it? I'd say there's three-part strategy. One is you look at the outside signs, the external signs, kick the tires. Then you get in, you drive it, you look at what's the actual content of the story. Does it hold together internally? And then you look at the whole environment, like where does this story fit in with everything else about this topic? So the external signs, who published it? That's the first question. Do you know the organization? Is it the Chicago Tribune or the Washington Post or the Manchester Union Leader, or is it something you've never heard of? It makes a difference, and we have responsibility, I think, now to find out where this stuff's coming from. I've learned, and we can figure this out, but I've learned how to filter my Facebook feed, so I get a lot less spurious sources in it, a lot fewer. Check the internet address. Again, make sure the brand name is consistent. Look for little red flags like a CO at the end of the address that can imply it's registered somewhere else. It's a phone in Colombia. It's a phony site. See if the name has changed slightly. Politico.com is a very influential and legitimate news source. Politicot.com, which you might type in by accident, is a fake news operation. Look at the date. Many times I see stories crop up. I did yesterday, I did today, pertaining maybe to a topic that's current now, but it's actually a story from like a year ago or 2 years ago, about a political figure. So you've got to watch that, and maybe I know I have shared obituaries of celebrities and thinking, oh my God, so-and-so died on Gilligan's Island, that's horrible. And then I share it, and then I see, oh, it was like 8 years ago. So, save yourself an embarrassing mistake by checking the date. I do that like first thing every time. Look at who wrote it. Do you know the journalist or who is, who's the person on camera? That's harder to do nowadays with the multiplicity of news organizations we get in our home. But if you're able to develop an understanding of where the author's coming from, that helps. Look at the ads around it. A junk news site will have a lot of junky ads. And any reputable news site will have an about section that says who they are, where they're published from, what their mission is, that kind of thing. So remember I said ourlandofthefree.com with the thugs. So if you look on their front page, it looks like a news site, it looks like a website giving news. If you click through about 4 pages, you get this. ourlandofthefree.com makes no guarantee that anything you find here will be based at all in reality. Okay, that's fine. They disclose it, but it's buried, and by that time, their story's been shared 1,000 times. It's not you, it's me, he says. Internally. So take a look. If this thing appeared on your desk with nothing but, a printout, does it hold up? Does it have the facts it needs within itself to hold up? Is it the original story? I see you get a lot of a lot of secondary sites. Let's say Huffington Post or Daily Caller or whatever. They'll pick up a story out of the New York Times and spin it their own way. They'll credit the New York Times, but they'll seize on something or maybe take something out of proportion. So is it the original story? If it's not, try to check out the original story. I mean, they have legitimate purposes in picking it up sometimes, but just make sure that they're within the realm of probability and credibility in the information they pick up. Is the headline supported? Basic news literacy task. Is there anything in the story that supports the headline? You'd be surprised how often there are not. Look at the direct quotes. Those are very telling. That's what the journalist puts in to say, here's how I know what I know. Here's what this person said. Is that person a named source? Is it an ex-official or a current official? Is it somebody on the outside, somebody on the inside? All that makes a difference. Look at how are the facts attributed. Is it source documents? Is it something that can be independently verified? Does it have a consistent news style? Or are there misspellings? Is the punctuation inconsistent? Do they abbreviate a state in one place, spell it out in the next? All those are signs of sloppy editorial control, and they erode the credibility of the story. Look for balance. That's, and not kind of a he said, she said, false equivalence that we've come to know and criticize, but does it acknowledge another viewpoint? Does it say, well, I hate to get into climate change because that's so polarizing, but does it at least address the opponent's arguments or the arguments of another viewpoint and attempt to say, this is why that's not holding up. Look for balance. It's a sign of legitimacy and credibility in a news story. Then you can look on the outside. And by that I mean look at what other outlets are saying about the same issue. There's a website, allsides.com. I'm sure there are others, but they present the news of the day from multiple sources as ranked by users on the left, right, or center. That's what these little boxes are here. So from the left, this was a story a couple weeks ago. Arizona Senator Jeff Flake says he won't seek re-election. The left says Flake shouldn't retire. He should run for re-election. Flake's a Republican, but he's critical of the president. From the center, my outfit Reuters kind of runs it down the middle. Republican senator and Trump critic says he will not seek re-election. And from the right, they're kind of dismissive. They say this was the Washington Times. This flake got snowed and will soon melt away. So it shows you how different political perspectives are perceiving the same event. Just kind of a nice thing to help aid your understanding. Here is a very complicated chart. It's gotten more so. It was first done last January or so by a lawyer in Denver, but it gives you a nice way to think about where news outlets stand in a spectrum from liberal to conservative, and from unreliable information to original reporting. And I'll give some of the extremes. So this red box here is says nonsense damaging to public discourse, and in there you'll find Daily Caller, Breitbart, Occupy Democrats, U.S. Uncut, things like that. National Enquirer is more maybe middle of the road politically, but they're also just unreliable. Fox News, they are, so this is the Fox News Daily Wire. This is their, their like .com or their Newswire service. I think she might have left the television outlet off of this version of her chart, but they kind of occupy this ground here where sometimes they're reliable and have analysis, and then other times it's doesn't add to the public discourse. And MSNBC kind of occupies a similar ground on this side. And then up here in the this yellow rectangle is fair interpretations of the news. They may be political, biased in left or right, but at least they use reason and logic and reasonable facts and so forth. She puts in things like The Economist, The Week, The Daily Beast, Washington Examiner, so forth and so on. And then up here, this is significant in that green rectangle is basically people, news organizations. They actually go out and get news. They hire people on the ground to find out things originally and report it. And they may be kind of on the left or right of the news spectrum, and I'll get to you in just a second, but that's what they do. You had a question?
Where can we find this chart? Is it available online?
Right behind you.
I have an
Yeah, it's in a handout. It is available online, and there's a link in the handout, I think.
Who created the chart?
A lawyer in Denver. It's a one-woman operation. You know, but she's been pretty responsive in dealing with, you know, back and forth discussion about it. You know, you can quibble with any one thing and things that have been left out. It's gotten a lot more cluttered as people say, oh, you should put this in, you should put that in. But its use comes more in just starting to think about what are the different categories of a news organization. You know, what do they set out to do? Do they send out reporters all over the world to get things firsthand? Or do they comment? Do they write about, interpret events, maybe with not so many people on the ground? You know, do they take strident political views? Are they promoting a specific point? And if you start to think about your news sources in that way, you know, it can again aid in understanding.
Is that your Reuters at the top?
It is, and I didn't put it there, but you know, I got to tell you, I'm incredibly proud. And this is not a strict, you know, we're at the top and New York Times is at the bottom of this circle. It's all kind of in there the same. The other wires, Associated Press, AFP, the French one, Bloomberg, you know, they all kind of reflect similar approaches. And one thing, though, about there's the next chart also shows a lot of trustworthiness you'll find in British organizations. And one thing is just, you know, having it from another perspective, I think, can aid in reliability or credibility a bit. Did you have a question?
Yeah, how do you reflect ownership?
Oh, Reuters is publicly traded. How does this reflect the ownership?
I'm thinking like of New Hampshire, you know, WMUR TV is owned by Sinclair.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
And they have very interesting biases that they just kind of periodically work in, but that really affects.
Yeah, well, Sinclair has gotten a lot of attention lately as a, you know, somewhat of a politically motivated broadcasting outlet. It's good to know that they're part of it. There's not much one can do about it, but again, it can help you. It can help you, you know, filter or analyze things.
To me, what's interesting about that chart is that the group at the top is primarily print, predominantly, I should say, print. Unless I'm.
Well, I think no, because like here's again, this is all together. So this has all the major networks, broadcast networks. It's got NPR, it's got BBC, which is both, you know, BBC is print and video, public broadcasting. But, you know, you get down here and you get to the cable networks, right?
Right.
I think there's a difference there. You know, print versus television or broadcast, they're different ways of understanding.
Well,
and
very different, very
Yeah.
different. And you know, McLuhan was right.
Yeah.
The media is the message. I mean, there's some things that television news cannot do,
Yeah.
and much that they can do badly.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, the most reliable sources seem to me to be the print journalists.
Yeah.
For
You know,
day-to-day-
television does things well too, but they do, one digests them differently and understands things differently from them, I think. Hey, go ahead.
One thing about this is it seems like it's based on, the criteria have to do with how stories are covered, but not which stories are covered.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, right. I mean, fair enough. I think that's part of evaluating. You know, obviously people will say, you know, you watch CNN, you watch Fox, you watch MSNBC, they cover completely different things. sometimes. And you're right, the choice of what they cover says as much about where they're coming from as in the,
80% about the Russia thing,
yeah,
all across the board.
right.
So
Right.
what are we not hearing about? Because we're hearing so much about Russia.
Yeah. Well, that's one good thing. We have this multiplicity of sources where if we're inquisitive, if we're adventurous, we can look around. I'll skip through this. We covered that. But some public news sources. I mean, I get asked a lot. Well, I can't subscribe to all these, outlets. Cost a lot of money. New York Times costs hundreds of dollars a year. It's so forth. But there are some ways you can compile a reasonable news digest for yourself, or a news diet, without a lot of money, without spending a lot of money, I should say. Couple things, if you have tablets or mobile devices, Flipboard and Apple News both offer you an opportunity to kind of choose amongst a large diet of news sources and topics to produce a daily feed for yourself. Like a Flipboard you can get on the web too, on a desktop, but it's really designed to work on a mobile phone or a tablet. I use it a lot. I recommend it a lot. But I've also gotten to appreciate Apple News, which they kind of force on you if you have an iPhone now. But the idea that these aggregators offer you the opportunity to choose a bunch of sources gives you a lot of control, or a lot of ability to tailor your news diet. Free on the web, you can get Reuters.com, Associated Press, really, good, straightforward breaking news coverage with some depth as well to try and put some context about what the breaking news is about. If you want to start your day with a daily diet, the Boston Globe, New York Times have these nice handy little newsletters that might give a paragraph or two of the top stories, maybe a little breezy dialogue. You can connect through to the main site, which sometimes is protected by a paywall or whatever. But you can get that in your email every day, kind of read in if you want. Axios and Political are both more kind of specialized, kind of news junkie services. But it is original reporting. It's very, very solidly done and pretty politically unbiased, although it's politically hardcore. Fact checkers, Snopes. They started way back debunking urban legends. The kind of story about the cat in the microwave or whatever. But
It was a poodle.
what's that?
It was a poodle.
A poodle in a microwave. Okay, well, see, I got a fact checker right here. But they came well suited to the internet age. They now work with Facebook. PolitiFact is another one. You go in. They can either give you top debunked stories of the day, or you can ask it a question. Did a lady really put a poodle in a microwave? And it'll say yes or no. But it'll also give it'll explain how they researched it, what their facts are based on.
I think the good thing about kind of just like the nature of the U.S. is we have a lot of these sites, and we have, in case you thought that one might be biased or you felt it might be biased, you could always go to a different site.
That's right. That's right.
Like if you really felt that you were getting a bias kind of fact checking, you could always move on to a different site.
Yes, and there is a fact checker for the fact checkers.
Yeah.
It's pointer.org. It's a journalism nonprofit.
Yeah.
And that's poynter.org. And they rate or discuss each fact checking organization. One thing about Snopes, it has been a mom and pop operation. Mom and pop are getting divorced. It's messy, and organizations that's true. They'll acknowledge it. But organizations that were targeted by Snopes, the Daily Mail in the UK in particular, have played up this divorce and saying this shows their body, whatever. They've kind of, used that, parlayed that into an attack point for Snopes, for questioning their objectivity. So, I'll go to these talks and sometimes people in the audience will say, well, I heard Snopes untrustworthy now too. And that's where that's coming from. But so far, when I've checked things on Snopes, it seems pretty straightforward, straight down the middle. Facebook is now trying, all these things. Facebook's trying to give you tools to fight fake news. Google is trying to dry up the source of advertising to fake news sites. Twitter is, I don't know what they're doing, but they're trying to. A lot of these are kind of ineffectual because people find ways around it, or they're not having the psychological effects that people think. So anyway, Facebook gives you an opportunity to click in the upper right-hand section of a story, this little down arrow you might recognize, and report a post as fake news. If you go to share something that they have identified as fake news, it'll tell you this: it's disputed by multiple independent fact checkers. Are you sure you want to share it? Unfortunately, psychological research has shown it doesn't often dissuade people who would still be inclined to share it, but they're trying. Again, Reuters developed this thing called Tracer. It's used. It was developed for journalists, but it's publicly available, and it monitors the entire Twitter feed, but it samples it, and it spots stories that are like breaking. As soon as you get 3 or 4 tweets on an issue, it'll start clustering them together and say, oh, here's something going on. And it uses algorithms with like 700 different points to say, okay, this is probably a legitimate issue. It doesn't say the underlying story is accurate or not, but it's, as opposed to just pure hoax nonsense. So it'll rate it, veracity. That's what these little green dots are. And this yellow star will mean it's newsworthy, worth paying attention to. So it's just a way of, again, getting some kind of control over this massive tsunami of information. I don't know, maybe you remember the raid on bin Laden was first reported to the world by a tweet by a neighbor of the compound in Pakistan who heard shooting. And that was the first indication that something was going on. So it's worth monitoring this kind of thing. And since this was introduced last year, it has given the company some significant jumps on stories and being able to say, okay, this is real, it's happening, it's worth looking into. Education, I like this poster. But the museum in Washington, it was funded by Gannett Foundation, set up. They have a good educational program with educational material for schools and stuff on exercises and tips for identifying and dealing with fake news. And I think they deal with libraries too. I was first alerted to it when I gave a talk at my hometown library in Plastow.
Which museum is it?
Newseum, it's called.
Newseum.
Yeah, Newseum.
Is there material
Right there.
purchase, or is it available for free?
Well, this stuff's like for free.
Oh.
Yeah. If you go to Newseum, just search Newseum on the web, and you can click through to their educational materials. But they do have a separate kind of education site. Maybe type in Newseum and education. It's a pretty worthy endeavor. I'm impressed by it.
From the Smithsonian?
No, it's down there by all the Smithsonian museums, but it's set up by the Gannett Foundation, which Gannett owns USA Today and so forth. So they set it up. So once you're all educated, you can. Good old Lincoln. He said it best. He said it for all of us. And that concludes my prepared remarks, but we got. No, thanks a lot, all of you. Thank you. Yeah, this was great. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for. It's really nice to see students here, and thank you for bringing them.
It was a very interesting topic.
Good.